Well, I want to share a story here. About 3.5 years ago, my daughter and I went on a road trip to Nashville, Tennessee, right outside Nashville, right? And it was the most riveting time period of my daughter's life. We went to a bee conference. And so 3.5 years ago, my daughter and I go to this bee conference in Tennessee. And honestly, it was the best conference I've ever attended of anything. I mean, you got 175 people in that conference. And they were talking nonstop from like 9 in the morning until 5 p.m. at night. And the second day, on Saturday, we started at 9 a.m. in the morning and it went to 7 o'clock at night. And usually if you're in a conference, if I was at a teaching conference, for example, man, the moment the clock strikes 3, everybody's out of there. And around Nashville, why wouldn't you? I mean, there's all kinds of things to do in Nashville. But no, you looked around at 7 o'clock on Saturday night and that room was still full of people talking beekeeping. So if you're a beekeeper, you know, it was a great time. 175 people. We go back the next year and there's 800 people. And does that sound about right? So it grew from 175 to 800 people. This year, I went down there this year and we had like 1,600 people. The largest beekeeping conference in the nation. Maybe even in the world. I don't know if it's in the world or not, but certainly in the nation. It was huge. So this week, they shared on YouTube, hey, we got exciting information about the next year's conference. So I turned on YouTube, I watched about the conference, and the conference is called Hive Life. So now it's been branded Hive Life. Everybody talks about the Hive Life conference. Hey, are you going to the Hive Life? Are you going to the Hive Life? You know, everything about Hive Life. Gets on YouTube, and the guy, almost in tears, said that he had a disagreement with one of the members of the conference, and he was leaving the Hive Life conference. Cayman Reynolds, the guy who ran it, would have nothing more to do with Hive Life. So he and his wife are walking away. Now, and they were the ones that really put this thing together. I don't know the other business partner. I don't remember the guy's name. I don't know what kind of disagreement they had. I don't know what kind of falling out they had, but it was a big shock in the beekeeping world. So disagreements happen all the time, not just in personal lives, but also in businesses. Now I'm looking at this and I can see one of 3 things happens. Now this guy who's leaving Hive Life conference, he says he's going to start a new beekeeping conference. Doesn't know the name of it yet, but he's going to start a new conference. So I can only see one of 3 possible outcomes. Either A, he does start a new conference and Hive Life still continues, but probably with fewer people. Or B, Hive Life collapses entirely because that guy doesn't know how to run the conference. Or C, both future conferences fail, and there's no more beekeeping conferences. But no matter what happens, it was a sharp disagreement, and I don't know what led to that disagreement. And I don't know what happened. Well, it should be no surprise that disagreements happened in the church as well, in the early church. So we're going to go to our book of Acts, and we're in Acts 15. I'm going to start with verse 36. Okay, Acts chapter 15, starting with verse 36. After some time, Paul said to Barnabas. Now, Paul and Barnabas was his side buddy. Barnabas means son of encouragement, so Barnabas was an encourager. But Paul and Barnabas went on a missions trip and preached to many different churches. And after some time, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit each city where we previously preached the word of the Lord, to see how the new believers are doing. So let's just go on another trip. Let's go visit everybody again, make sure they're doing okay. Barnabas agreed and wanted to take along John Mark. But Paul disagreed strongly since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. Their disagreement was so sharp that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas, and as he left, the believers entrusted him to the Lord's gracious care. Then he traveled throughout Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches there. Their separation, their disagreement was so sharp. That's the way that it's worded in the Bible. This is Paul, one of the apostles. You'd think surely they wouldn't get into argument. I mean, this has to be a mature Christian, right? Barnabas has to be a mature Christian. How could they disagree so sharply? Now, they disagreed because Paul did not want to take along a person named John Mark. Somebody know who John Mark is? He was not one of the 12 disciples. He was a little boy at the time, or at least a younger boy at the time. And in one of the stories, I can't even tell you which book it was now. It might have been the book of John, or it might have been the book of Mark, which John Mark wrote. Okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. This John Mark is the one that wrote the book of Mark. And I think in the book of Mark, it tells when they rushed in, the disciples were so scared that one of the boys ran away naked. That was John Mark. So if you read that story, I'm just seeing you put things together here. That's John Mark. For some reason, we don't know why, but for some reason on their last missionary journey, John Mark left. And it made Paul upset. Paul was very upset. We don't know if he was homesick. We don't know if he just got tired. He had ADD. He was chasing squirrels. He wanted to go do something different. We don't know why John Mark left, but we know John Mark left Paul and Barnabas. And Paul now is very upset because he does not want to take John Mark again. So they separate. Now, what happens when we have separations or disagreements in the church? Kind of like the High Life Conference, multiple things could possibly happen. If they were mature Christians, as we think Paul and Barnabas were, they just disagreed, and they separate, it could be for the glory of the kingdom. And that's exactly what happened. Paul and Barnabas and John Mark went one direction, Paul and Silas went another direction, and they reached more people that way. So disagreements are not always bad. If they were immature Christians, Paul could have took Silas this way, Barnabas could have took John Mark this way, and they could have gotten nowhere fast. Maybe they needed each other in order to preach effectively. Thankfully, that was not the case, and they moved on. But that's where we get into disagreements in the church. This is one of the first major disagreements in the book, in the Christian church in general. Now, just so you know, if we fast forward several years, at the end of Paul's life, when he's imprisoned, he's calling for John Mark. He's praising John Mark. So somewhere they got reunited. And the scripture did not really specifically state how or when they got reunited, but we do know when Paul's writing his letters that John Mark is there and he wants John Mark and he wants John Mark to come and visit him. So it's all good. Things worked out for the best. I don't know if High Life is going to work out for the best, but thankfully for Paul and for us, the missionary journeys did work for the best. So now, who wrote the book of Acts again? Anybody remember who wrote the book of Acts? Not Paul. Acts is really a second book. It's a continuation of the first. Luke. Matthew, Mark, Luke. Luke wrote the book. Okay, so and Luke is writing Acts. Now, chapter 16. I'm going to fly through this one real quick because I think this is a very, to me, it's important to point out. 16 verse 1. Paul went first to Derbe and then to Lystra, where there was a young disciple named Timothy. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was Greek. Timothy was well thought of the believers in Lystra and Iconium, so Paul wanted him to join them on their journey. In deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left. We talked about this last week, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. Then they went from town to town, instructing the believers to follow the decisions made by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in their faith and grew larger every day. Next, Paul and Silas traveled through the area of Phrygia and Galatia because the Holy Spirit had prevented them from preaching the word in the province of Asia at that time. Then coming to the borders of Mysia, they headed north to the province of Bithynia, but again the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them to go there. So instead, they went on through the Mysia to the seaport of Troas. That night, Paul had a vision. A man from Macedonia in northern Greece was standing there pleading with him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." So we decided to leave for Macedonia at once, having concluded that God was calling us to preach the good news there. What'd you pick up in that last sentence? We, us. No longer, Luke is writing this book, no longer is Luke writing as a third person. He is now an eyewitness. So if you look at the whole book of Luke, in the first 15 chapters of Acts, Luke was writing a report to the honorable Theophilus, telling him what all's happening with Jesus. Now Luke is in the mix. So one of two things here, when Luke changes from third person to saying we and saying us, one of two things happen. Either A, he just now became a believer, or B, he just now caught up with Paul. And everything from now on to the rest of Acts is written in first hand by Luke. He was there. Everything up to this point in time, Luke is just simply writing a narrative of what he was told and what he learned from Paul. So we decided to leave from Macedonia at once, having concluded that God was calling us to preach the good news there. That also means Luke is now clearly a believer. If he wasn't a believer initially, if he was just writing a report, going down there to write an article to send it back to Theophilus, maybe he was just writing details. But somewhere along the line, he became a believer because now Luke is joining Paul and we are going to preach. So either he converted right here or he finally caught up with Luke right here. Again, with disagreements happen all the time. Thankfully, they don't happen much here at Back Creek, but they do. I mean, disagreements do happen. I think the best thing we can do is pray through those disagreements. Let the Lord be glorified in all of our disagreements. Sometimes there's reasons for disagreements. In this case, they got mad because of John Mark. They split up. Well, it actually benefited the kingdom. More people were reached. More people were preached to. And Luke was one of those preachers, as he mentions right there in that last verse. I do think it's to use caution when we have disagreements. We should bitter, sharp disagreements. We should always turn it over to the Lord and ask the Lord for his assistance. Pray that whatever the outcome is, it will glorify God. And thankfully, in the book of Acts, that's exactly what happened. It did glorify God in the process of that disagreement.